Hello, my name is Ezequias Reyes Gonzalez. I'm a PhD student at the Baja California State University in Mexico. We're very pleased here at UABC to welcome fellow graduate students enrolled in any of the 3 graduate programs offered here at this school, namely the Graduate Certificate Program in Translation and Interpretation, the Master's Program in Modern Languages, and the PhD Program in Language Studies. We'd also like to welcome our undergraduate students, faculty, and alumni who are following this live stream on YouTube. It's my privilege to introduce our distinguished guest speaker today, Professor David Crystal. He's a writer, editor, lecturer, and broadcaster. He's authored and co-authored a number of books. His authored works are mainly in the field of language, including several Penguin books, but he is perhaps best known for his 2 encyclopedias for Cambridge University Press, the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Language and the Cambridge Encyclopedia of English Language. We want to express our gratitude and appreciation to the president of our university, Dr. Daniel Octavio Valdez Delgadillo, and the dean of the School of Languages, Dr. Gabriel Marquez Escudero, to whom we are grateful for their invaluable support to the student community and for their great efforts in making this event possible. Also to Dr. Laura Fierro, the Director of Graduate Studies, for her commitment to students, the teaching profession. Finally, on behalf of the faculty and the student community at UABC, I'd like to welcome you, Professor Crystal, to our university. Fernanda.
Okay. Hi, welcome, Professor. My name is Maria Fernanda Rodriguez. I am also a student from the PhD program in Language Sciences. And the title of today's talk is Pragmatics, the Final Frontier. This talk is going to be live streamed in YouTube as soon as possible. And as we go along, we would ask all the attendees to write their questions in the chat, and we will address them at the end of the talk. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Crystal, and please take it away, Professor.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. And hello, everybody. I wish I could see you. I can see some of you, but not all. I'm speaking to you from my home here in Wales, in North Wales. If you know the British Isles, I'm in Holyhead, which is the geographical centre of the British Isles. It's the little port where you take a ferry boat if you're going to Dublin in Ireland. And the main thing about this part of the world is that we get a lot of rain and wind coming from your part of the world. And we are in the middle of a storm at the moment. So if you hear some very strange howling noises, it is not me. It is the wind outside. I wish I was with you. I've been to Mexico 3 times, I think, in various places, and it's always been a delight. But this is better than nothing. And I thank you for the invitation. Very much thank the people who have sponsored this visit as well. You're quite right there. This is so important that people allow this kind of thing to happen. And thank you to Laura for a very good choice of subject. Yes, pragmatics is indeed an excellent choice of subject. And it's my favorite subject, actually. You probably didn't know that, but it is. And I'm going to tell you why. And why I've called it the final frontier. I mean, it's space, the final frontier, isn't it? That's the illusion. There's nothing beyond space. Well, is there anything beyond pragmatics? Well, at the end of the talk, I'll suggest maybe there is. But for me, at the moment, and in our intellectual period, pragmatics is for me, the most important thing. And I'll tell you why. It's all to do with the history of the subject of language study. People have been studying language for as long as there have been people. There are records going back to ancient times. But the modern scientific study of language began, as I'm sure most of you know, in the 18th century with the subject of comparative philology, the comparison of different languages and their histories, mainly the study of the written language, of course. And it was only in the 19th century, towards the end of that century, that people began to develop the subject which today we would call linguistics, and a modern approach in which spoken language as well as written language are given equal eminence, and a scientific approach generally develops. But the question is, which aspects of language did it develop? And if you look at the studies that were being done from this new perspective towards the end of the 19th century, you'll see that they were mainly to do with pronunciation. The development of the International Phonetic Alphabet, for instance. We can't do without that these days, the IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet. The 1880s, that's when that developed. And around it became several kinds of study to do with the pronunciation of speech. There is a subject which in Britain and in some other parts of the world is called speech therapy. In America, speech pathology. And it's, notice, speech. And these therapists, when they were beginning their program of work at the end of the 19th century, it was almost entirely just on pronunciation. People felt that pronunciation was the big thing. And so you get the development of the subject of phonetics. And that was how it was for quite a long time. And then after a while, people realized that you can't just study sounds in the sense of how we articulate them and listen to them and how the brain processes them in both normal and pathological conditions. No, there's more to it than that. We have to talk about the sounds of an individual language if we're really going to get into language study. Phonetics is a very general subject. And so you get the development then in the 1920s, really, of a subject that we now call phonology. Phonology, the study of the sound systems of languages. Which particular sounds does English use compared with Spanish, for example? What are the differences between the two sound systems? Looking at both the segments of sound, the vowels and the consonants, and also the tones of voice, the intonation, the rhythm, all of those aspects too. And phonology as a subject dominated linguistic thinking in the 1920s and early 1930s. And then after a while, people realized that there must be more to language study than that. What, after all, are sounds used for? Sounds are used to make syllables, and syllables are used to make words, and words are used in sentences. So isn't it about time that we started studying sentences, or grammar, as it had always been called? A scientific approach to grammar? Don't get much of that until the end of the 1920s, and it starts with the study of word structure. Morphology is the technical term for that, the study of the structure of words. First big studies of morphology at the end of the 1920s, early 1930s. And then people realized that it isn't just words alone that make grammar. You have to talk about sentence structure as well. So syntax, in the sense of the syntactic arrangement of words in sentences, and also beyond sentences in paragraphs and things like that, begins to develop in the 1930s and 40s, and of course comes to massive fruition in the work of Noam Chomsky and others in the 1950s. So there we are. We've got sounds, we've got phonetics, we've got phonology, we've got morphology, we've got syntax. And you know, when I started my studies in linguistics in the 1950s and 60s, I was given a very strong impression that that was the end of the story. Nothing more to it than that. If you study syntax, you've studied everything, really. And that was Chomsky's fault, pretty well. Or Chomsky's contribution, should I say, rather than fault. But, you know, that was it. Syntax was the goal. I spent all my time studying syntax in the early 1960s. And then people discovered something else. They realized that it's all very well studying the formal structures of language, but what are these formal structures doing? They're there to express meaning. Oh, yes, meaning. We'd forgotten about that. Indeed, some people said in the 1930s, Leonard Bloomfield, for instance, that meaning is not really a possible subject of scientific study. It's too vague, too amorphous. You can't really study meaning in a very scientific sort of way. Well, yes, you can. And that was really the development in the 1970s. Semantics we're talking about now. Semantics, the science of meaning. And the first big books on semantics coming out then, books like John Lyons's book on semantics, all in the 1970s and into the 1980s. So now we have a very different area of language that people felt was the end of the story. After all, if you're studying the forms of language on the one hand and the meanings of language on the other, that's it, nothing more to be said. And then they discovered pragmatics. It's the 1980s now, the late 1980s, and the first books on pragmatics are beginning to appear. And I don't want you to be scared of the term pragmatics. It may be familiar to many of you. For some of you, it's a new term. What do I mean? What did people mean by pragmatics? They meant this, it's the ordinary everyday sense of the word, pragmatic. If I say to you, John is a very pragmatic person, what do I mean? I mean that he's a person who's cool. He's very flexible, he's tolerant. He responds to situations as need arises. He behaves this way in relation to that situation. He behaves in a different, maybe even contradictory way in relation to that situation. He's being pragmatic. The opposite of pragmatic is dogmatic. To be dogmatic about something is to say, I always do something or other, whatever it is. I always believe this. I always behave like that. No exceptions. That's being dogmatic about something. What are you guys out there? What am I? I think we all like to think we're pragmatic, though perhaps some of us are a bit dogmatic sometimes about some things. But pragmatic, you see, is opposite to dogmatic. In dogmatic, you don't have a choice because you are always thinking along a certain line. In pragmatics, you do have a choice. You are choosing. And this is the critical word when you're studying pragmatics. It is the study of choice, the choices you make, not just in behavior now, but in language. Pragmatics is the study of the choices you make when you use language. And that's my definition of it. But there's a bit more to the definition than that. Yes, pragmatics is the study of the choices you make, but also the reasons for those choices and the effects that the choices have once you've made them on other people. Three aspects then: the choices, the reasons, and the effects. And when pragmatics developed as a subject, to begin with, people were very uncertain about how to deal with it because, you see, some books studied the choices, some books studied the reasons, and some books studied the effects. So you look at books on pragmatics from that period and look at the contents at the beginning, they look like three different types of books because depending upon your focus, so different sorts of things were coming to the fore. Now, if you're making a choice about something in language, choosing something, and I'll be going through examples of this in just a few moments, this perhaps gets across to you the reason why I think it is so important. Because if I'm making a choice about how to speak to you, how to write to you, how to sign to you, the reasons for those choices, why have I chosen to speak to you in a particular way or to write to you in a particular way? Why? That's the word, why. Pragmatics is so important because it was the first time that people started to study why in language. In phonetics, people studied what, and in morphology and in syntax, they studied the what of language. What was language all about? In historical studies, you're studying the when of language. In sociolinguistics and dialectology, the study of dialects and accents and things like that, you're studying the where of language. Where is language? And in studying multilingualism, we're studying the where of language. But nobody studied why. Not why are we using language, because that's a big subject or a different kind, though it's part of what we're talking about. But no, why are we making particular choices in using language? Nobody had studied why before the subject of pragmatics came along. And so those of you who are in the business of teaching, you surely will immediately recognize the relevance of this to the kind of work that you do, and sense straight away that actually you're doing pragmatics a lot of the time, maybe without realizing it. So a student writes a piece of work and it goes to a teacher, and a teacher corrects it. Now, a teacher that just says, this is wrong, says nothing more than that, that's not very satisfactory, is it? No, this is wrong, and I'll tell you why it's wrong. And teachers who do that are automatically adopting a pragmatic approach. And all good teachers do this, it seems to me. You explain what is going on. And from a student point of view, the explanation is there as well. I am going to speak to you. I am going to write to you. What sort of language am I going to use? Why should I speak in this particular way rather than that particular way? Take, for example, the difference between formal and informal speech. Shall I speak to you in an informal way? Shall I write to you in an informal way? Or shall I speak and write to you in a formal way? And if I choose the one rather than the other, why have I done that? Why do I choose informality? What's at the back of my mind? That's the reason for it, you see, the intention in my mind. But then the other side of the coin, remember, what effect will this have on you, my listener, my reader? Will I get it right? If I choose to be informal when you are expecting me to be formal, then there's going to be a problem. And conversely, if I speak or write to you in a very formal kind of way, and you are expecting me to be informal, that's a problem as well. To take one very common area of pragmatics in this context, using first names or surnames. How do we address each other? Good evening, Professor Crystal. Good evening, Crystal. Good evening, David. Good evening, Dave. Good evening, David Crystal. Good evening, Professor David Crystal. Good evening, Professor Dr. David Crystal. There are so many alternatives, and each one carries a different charge, doesn't it? Professor, Doctor, that's probably the most formal you could probably do. You could also put letters after the name as well, you know, all the degrees and things like that. That's maximally formal. And at the opposite extreme, you know, hi, Dave, how you doing? You know, how's things? Well, you can sense immediately that that spectrum of formality, where on it should one be when one is talking to somebody that one knows? And here there are differences of culture. There are big differences between British English and American English, for instance, in respect of the readiness to use somebody's first name. Often get telephone calls here. And if somebody says, you know, hello, is that David? Then it's obviously somebody I know, a friend, a relative, or something like this, you know, fine. But if the voice comes across and says, you know, hi, is that David? I don't recognize the voice. You don't know me, but I've got some good insurance here that I think you might want to buy. sorry, it is a thing that Americans do tend to go into first name terms much more readily than the British do. The British are, after all, somewhat reserved, aren't they, in this respect? You know, there's a certain difference of tradition here. That's the sort of thing I mean. The person who is using my first name is trying to be friendly and intimate, but I'm not reacting in the way that he hoped. So there can be a clash between the reason that you use a particular usage and the effect that that usage can convey. Or to take an example from the written language. Just the other day, I was shown a letter by a friend of mine who's an employer of a business in our area. And he showed me a letter of application for a job written by a teenager, an older teenager, wanting a summer job. And the letter began, "Hi," and ended with an emoji. And the employer, who was a somewhat conservative individual, said that this is just not appropriate. You know, I would expect to have a rather more formal letter if somebody is asking me for an interview for a job. Obviously, once again, there is a clash of expectations here. Maybe perhaps that student should have been told a little bit more about the differences between formal and informal English and appropriateness and inappropriateness and so on. And of course, these norms vary greatly depending upon the medium that you're using. So if you're using a formal letter, as was this student, writing a letter, actually not an email, not a text, not anything on social media, what the student was doing, of course, was assuming that the kind of informal messaging that is perfectly appropriate in social platforms of one kind and another, in texting and in YouTube and Facebook and all of that, not appropriate in formal letter writing. And that kind of sense of appropriateness is something that, well, I think ought to be taught in schools, is being taught in schools. I've been to some schools where I've seen that kind of thing being taught, but obviously this particular student hadn't picked that up. So this is what the subject of pragmatics deals with. It deals with the choices that people make, the reasons for the choices, and the effects that the choices have on other people. And therefore, it is a universal subject. There is no aspect of language that can be expressed that doesn't involve a pragmatic consideration. Pragmatics underlies everything that we do. Every bit of conversation, every bit of written language, every bit of formal lecturing and all the rest of it, there's a pragmatic force there. It's always there. And therefore, it's one of the things that I think really needs a great deal of exploration, of research. And the results of the research can often produce findings that really are quite surprising. Now, I'm going to now go through different aspects of language in order to illustrate these general points. I'm going to take examples from grammar. I've given you an example already from vocabulary, really, in the sense of first names. I'll take an example from pronunciation, I think, as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about cultural variation. And then perhaps there'll be some time for, well, I mean, there will be some time for questions, and we can go in other directions then, depending upon sorts of things that interest you. So let's begin with grammar, because that's the area where people have most trouble understanding how pragmatics operates. Because you know the score as well as I do. I've learned foreign languages, you've learned foreign languages, you know that we are given grammatical rules and told that that is the way people speak or in a particular language. End of story. You learn the rule, you learn how to speak, you learn whatever the syntactic rule is, the morphological rule is, and very often the textbooks and the teachers simply teach you the rule. When you learn the rule, you become fluent in it. But often without really sometimes knowing why. Now, the example I'm going to use to illustrate this is a syntactic rule in English, and you have it in Spanish too. The difference between active sentences and passive sentences. Now, you may be familiar with that. I don't make any assumptions, so let me just for a moment explain what that difference is. It's the difference between saying the cat chased the mouse and the mouse was chased by the cat. The first is an active sentence in the grammar books. The second is a passive sentence. The cat chased the mouse is called active. The mouse chased the cat. No, the mouse was chased by the cat is called passive. Did you learn that? I've learned that in other languages. Did you learn that? You know how to make the distinction. You know how to transform the one into the other and so on. Fine. End of story? No, it's the beginning of the story from my point of view. Because the interesting question is why? Why is there an active and a passive in language? Because think of it from a point of view of meaning. The cat chased the mouse. The mouse was chased by the cat. They mean the same thing. So why should we have two grammatical constructions that mean the same thing? It seems stupid, seems redundant. Why not just have one? There has to be a reason, you see. Has to be a reason. And that's what pragmatics does. It explores the reasons. So let's go into those two types of sentence for a minute. The cat chased the mouse. Why is it called active? Because when the grammarians first thought up this distinction, and we're talking 2,000 years ago now, they thought about it like this. The first part of the sentence, the cat, is doing the action. Think Tom and Jerry, okay? So the cat is chasing. Ah, there's the action there, it's expressed. Chasing who? Chasing this little mouse. The mouse is not there yet. The action is already going on. We don't know who the cat is chasing. It's chasing somebody. The action is there, you see. The mouse, it's a mouse, is it? Okay. Could be chasing something else. The other way around, the mouse was chased by the cat. The mouse begins the sentence. Think Jerry sitting there. I'm a mouse. Life is fine. Nothing's happening. I'm a mouse. The mouse was, yes, and is. The mouse was chased. Oh, okay. Yes, I'm being chased, am I? By a female mouse? It could be good. Yes, life is fine. The mouse was chased by the cat. What? I'm out of here. You see, the action comes towards the end of the sentence. The mouse is being passive at the beginning of the sentence, isn't doing anything. And that's how the term began, you see. That's how the term began. So there are these two forms where the action is at the beginning and the action is towards the end. Why is there a difference between the two? Well, in order to study this kind of thing, you have to look at the way in which both constructions are used. Normally, we speak in active sentences. That's the normal thing. I did something, you did something, they did something. That's the normal way. Why would one want to do it the other way round and use a passive construction? Well, now let's take some examples. Here's one from a school. I actually heard this when I was going into schools once. I was with the teacher in this classroom, and there was a noise outside of a window breaking. The teacher rushed outside, and there was little Jimmy with a football on the other side of the broken window. The teacher was, Jimmy, who did that? Jimmy turned to the teacher. This is a 9-year-old, 9.5-year-old, turned to a teacher and said, "The window's been broken, miss. The window's been broken." He used a passive construction brilliantly. He did not use the active construction, which would have been, "I broke the window." He's not going to do that. That would admit responsibility. That would admit guilt. He's going to get into trouble. No, he hopes he will get out of trouble by using a passive construction. The window's been broken. Somebody has broken the window. We don't know who, and it doesn't matter. What, was it me? Well, I'm not. Windows be broken. That's one use of the passive. To avoid responsibility, to imply that somebody else did the problem, was the cause of the problem. Yeah. Teacher, of course, immediately said, "Yes, I can see the window's been broken, Jimmy, but who broke the window? Give me an active sentence, please," was the implication. And then, of course, he had to say, "Well, it was me, but it was an accident." And so he went on. So that's one use of the passive, to avoid responsibility. Who did that? And you don't want to say who. So you say, "Oh, it was done." You know, it was done by somebody. Another example. You're walking down a street past a newspaper shop. Outside the newspaper shop, it says 200 killed. And you think, what? A lovely passive construction, you see. Elliptical, short, 200 have been killed. How? Who killed them? What? You want to find out. You go into the shop to buy the newspaper to find out who killed everybody. And it was 200 killed by tornado or something, you see. But they don't put the by tornado bit on the advertisement. They just say 200 killed. That's what advertisers do. They want to tempt you. They want to get your curiosity going. So they don't say who did it. They just use the passive, 200 killed. To find out, you've got to go and buy the newspaper. Imagine if you'd been passing that shop and the newspaper, the agent had, the advertisement said, "Tornado kills 200 people." Well, now you know. You're not so curious anymore. You're going to buy the newspaper now? Well, you might do, but you're less likely to. So this is a second reason for using the passive, to generate a curiosity, because you're not saying who the actor of the sentence is. Go a little further down the street and you see a sign in Britain, and you'll have the equivalent in Spanish too. Entry prohibited. Entry prohibited. A lovely passive construction. Now, depending upon how radical you are, you look at that and you say, who is prohibiting me? How dare they prohibit me? Why am I not allowed to go in here? Do you ever see a sign which says, "We prohibit you," or "This organization prohibits you," or "John and Mary prohibit you"? No, you don't. It's always a passive construction where nobody actually says who is doing the prohibiting. Why? I don't know. That's up to them to decide. Maybe they don't want you to know. Maybe they have no right to prohibit you. Using the passive is a very good way of evading responsibility, of not being explicit. Politicians do this a lot. They don't actually use actives, they use passives, because then nobody can say, "You said this." No, it was said by somebody. It was said. It was recommended. Who recommended it? Did you recommend it? It was recommended, says the politician, not saying who. Now, these are examples from everyday walks of life. And I've given examples from, well, both spoken and written language, but in everyday circumstances, we do use passives in this sort of way, not so much because we want to hide something, to evade something, simply because it's not important to know who the actor is, who the speaker is. Here's an example from every day. So somebody just comes into the room and says, I've just had my hair done. I've just had my hair done. What's your sentence? What's your question going to be? Who did it? Really? In comes my wife, having just had her hair done, and I say, who did it? And depending on my tone of voice, it could mean, what a terrible hairdo you just had. Who did it? What? No, I want to avoid that altogether. No, gorgeous hair, darling, gorgeous hair. Yes. No, I'm not going to ask who did it, unless, of course, she's had her hair done by the top hairdresser of the world. You know, Germani di Dobedi has done it. Who did it? Oh, it was Germani, was it? Oh, of course, fantastic, yeah. But normally, it's not important to know. She's come from a hairdresser's where the hairdressers are just ordinary people. They're not famous. I don't know them. I don't need to know them. All I need to know is that she's just had her hair done. And if she were to tell me who it was, it wouldn't mean anything to me. I could tell you, I've just had my house painted. Is your question going to be, oh, really, David, who painted it? If I were to tell you, it would be of no use, that information. You don't know the painter who did it. It's not important. So these passives, you see, are being used where it's not important to know who the actor is. Now, these are just some of the uses of the passive in English. And there will be similar reasoning behind the passive in Spanish too, and other languages. But notice that in order to explain why a passive is being used, we have to explore the real world out there. This is grammar in the real world of the street, the real world of the home, and the real world of the classroom too. Because here's one more example for you before I move on. A science class is taking place now in a school. And the student is told to write up the experiment that they've just done. Now, what sort of writing would you expect to see in a student essay here? Can you imagine this particular student essay being written? Hello, teacher. Mary and I were in the science class, and Mary had a red frock on, and I didn't have a tie on yesterday because I lost it. And we saw the test tube, and you put the mixture into the test tube, and then you go. Is that how you write a scientific report? Of course not. Anybody who tried to do that in science would get 0 marks. It's not, but you have to ask, why is that wrong? And the answer is because it's irrelevant. Who cares what dress she was wearing or whether you were wearing a tie or not? What's that got to do with the scientific experiment? Nothing. Oh, okay. Well, then I'll just say, Mary poured the mixture into the test tube. No, that's not relevant either. Who cares if it was Mary? The important thing, but the mixture was poured into the test tube. Notice I've now switched into a passive. The mixture was poured. Who cares who pours the mixture into the test tube? That is not relevant in the study of science. And that is why in scientific English, if you read a report or a textbook or whatever, you will find frequent uses of the passive. The passive is the normal way of talking about scientific experiments. It is not important to know who the actor is when mixtures are being made, and all the other passives that turn up in the description of a scientific report. So here's what, 4 or 5 examples of why the passive is used. And notice the pedagogical implication, because I've often come across a class where the teacher has said, you must use the passive in writing up your report. And nobody tells the students why. It's because science is objective. Science is impersonal. And to be impersonal is to avoid the active and to use the passive, you see. Now, all of this, the last 10 minutes of my talk here, has been to illustrate one very specific point, and that is that a point of grammar, which you may previously have thought of as just being a rather boring one type of construction relating to another type of construction, and we can use them both, suddenly becomes alive and into the real world. And we're studying culture now, and science, and newspaper advertisements, and politicians, and all of this. The pragmatics makes grammar come alive, out of the page, into the street. And the generalization is this: any bit of grammar that you've ever studied can be studied from a pragmatic point of view. Anything, doesn't matter what it is, from the most basic grammatical constructions to the most advanced grammatical constructions. It applies to the most elementary things and the most advanced things. Let me give you a couple of examples of the most elementary things to illustrate my point, and very relevant here because it's all to do with young people's learning of grammar, where they want to see the relevance of what you're teaching them and how you're learning about it. So let's take the most basic thing of all, the sentence. We have to speak in sentences if you're learning a language. You have to write in sentences. So you're writing in sentences. Okay, what is a sentence then? Well, the textbooks will tell you there are sentences that express statements, there are questions, there are commands, and there are exclamations. That sort of classification of sentences. How do you show that in writing? Well, if it's a question, you put a question mark at the end, and in your language, sometimes at the beginning as well. If it's an exclamation mark at the end in English. If it's a command, also sometimes an exclamation mark. But if it's a statement, how do you punctuate a statement? You put in a full stop, a period, as the Americans say, at the end of your statement. Fine, okay, that's how you were taught. That's how I was taught when I was in primary school. You must end a statement with a full stop. Otherwise, it's wrong. And you will be beaten. I'm thinking 50 years ago, you don't beat people these days, do you really? Except intellectually. Yes, you end statements with full stops. Great, okay. Why? Oh, I don't know, because you do. Why? 2 reasons. 1, to show that the statement is finished. Completeness. 2, to separate sentences from each other that are statements, so that they don't blur into each other. Oh, okay, that's good news. Thank you. A pragmatic explanation. I never got it. I've learned it since. But here's the point. Now let's go online. And we're online now. We're in Twitter or WhatsApp or somewhere like that. Let's take WhatsApp as an example. I'm WhatsApping you. And if I'm asking you a question, I will put a question mark in. And if I'm giving you an exclamation, I will put an exclamation mark in. But if I'm giving you a statement, will I put a full stop at the end of my statement? In WhatsApp or Twitter or TikTok and all the others that are out there now? No, you don't. I mean, there are some people who do because it is right to put a full stop in, but the vast majority of people don't, and no young person would. So if I'm sending you a WhatsApp message and say, the party's on tonight, would you type a full stop at the end of that statement? Of course you wouldn't. People don't. Why? For two reasons. One, it's not necessary to show that the sentence has come to an end because the sentence is short and the screen tells you that the sentence is finished. And secondly, there's no need for a full stop to separate sentences because the vast majority of messages have only got one sentence anyway. So you leave it out. It's unnecessary. And now here's the interesting pragmatic point. So now what happens if you put it in? What happens if you put a full stop at the end of a statement in a WhatsApp message or one of the other platforms? So here's an example. Are you coming to the party tonight? And the next person says, yes, I'm coming. And the first person says, Johnny will be there. Johnny will be there. Without a full stop, it simply means Johnny will be there. But if you put a full stop in, what does it mean? Well, for young people today, it means, oh dear, Johnny will be there, full stop. Ooh, that full stop now carries an emotional charge of some kind. Older people don't realize this. I've realized it because I study this kind of thing. But most of the people of my age have no idea that a full stop with young people carries an emotional charge of some kind in that sort of situation. Why are you shouting at me? Why are you being aggressive? Full stop is carrying a charge. And it's going up the age range, actually. I came across an email to me the other day from one of my kids, and they're in their 30s and 40s. And towards the end of the text exchange, there were no full stops after statements, and I wasn't using them either because I accommodate to the norm of these people, these youngsters. And towards the end of the conversation, my daughter put in a full stop at the end, implying it's time to end the conversation. I have to go now. That full stop kind of said to me, the mood of the conversation is changing a little bit. So you see, when we're talking about pragmatics, we're talking about the reasons why people use even the most basic elements of communication, like full stops and basic sentences. And one other example before I leave grammar behind. The notion of pragmatics is relevant because it helps us see why people use concepts like singular and plural, or present tense and past tense, and so on. Let's take the tense example. We can talk about others later in the question time if you want. You've got present tense and past tense. You all know this. I am walking, I walked. That sort of thing. I walk, I walked. I am walking, I was walking. All of that. And all the other tenses that you've sweated blood over, and I sweated blood over when I tried to learn Spanish once. Your tenses are worse than mine. Anyway, so why do you use the present tense? Why do you use the past tense? That's the pragmatic question. And you might think the answer is obvious. Well, you use the present tense to talk about present time. And you use the past tense to talk about past time. Well, if only it were so easy. because you know very well that you can say, and my examples are from English, but you can transfer them into Spanish and other languages as you wish. You can say, I'm going to town, means I am going to town right now. I'm in the process of going to town, present time. But you can also say, I'm going to town tomorrow. And suddenly the present tense is referring to future time because of the future adverb that's coming next. And you think, oh, yes, so there's more to it than that. And here's the example I want to present to you where pragmatics is so important. I'm going to tell you a story now about what happened last week. Are you ready for this story? Well, last week, I'm walking down the road in Holyhead here where I live, and I see this man coming towards me. And this man has a big hat on his head, and he comes up to me and he tells me, hang on a minute, Dave, you're using the present tense all the time about something that happened last week. What's going on? Why are you using the present tense? You see the pragmatic question. Why are you using the present tense? Because I could have said, last week, I went to town and I was walking along the road and I saw a man coming towards me and he was wearing a hat and so on. What's the difference? And the difference is, well, that use of the present tense, you may have come across it in grammar books. It's sometimes called the dramatic present. Because what's happening is that by using the present tense, I'm trying to make the past time seem close now. So there's dramatic use of a narrative. Use the past tense and it's all in the distance, in the past. Use the present tense and you're bringing the past into the present, which is what very often people do when they're telling a story that they want to make dramatic in that way. So there we are, a number of examples of the pragmatic perspective for this kind of analysis. So I've given you an example of vocabulary earlier on when I talked about naming each other, terms of address. I've given you some examples of grammar. I'll just give you one example from pronunciation before we stop and have a little bit of a general chat about what's going on here. Intonation choices. Use intonation, melody, tone of voice to express meaning. You have to learn this. You have to learn that the patterns of intonation are different between English and Spanish. Not totally different, but different in certain respects. And one of the things you might not have noticed is that there are differences in intonation between different dialects of English, and in particular between British and American English. And only a pragmatic perspective will focus you in on what these differences are. Because you see, both dialects, both accents of English, British and American, use the same kinds of intonation pattern, but they use them in different ways sometimes. Not always, just in some respects. I'm going to give you one example. And it's of the intonation pattern that is called in the phonetics textbooks a falling rising tone. Falling rising. Falling tone. Rising tone. Put it together and you get the tone that sounds like this. So you've all heard that millions of times, and perhaps you've learned to use it yourself. And it's, of course, can be used in other languages too. What does it mean, though? What's the pragmatic force of using a falling rising tone? Well, it's a tone that in British English is usually there to express a notion of doubt or hesitation or uncertainty. Are you going out tonight? Yes. With a falling tone means yes, I am. Are you going out tonight? Yes. Means no, or means I'm not sure, or I'm thinking about it. Yeah. Very important to get that, pick up that sense. It's often accompanied by facial expression, of course, but on a telephone, for instance, or online where you don't see the other person's face, it's very important to pick up the nuance there. Means maybe, maybe. Now, here's the point. In American English, it only sometimes has that value. Often in American English, it doesn't have that value at all. It's perfectly neutral. Have a nice day. Have a nice day. Does not mean I am doubtful about you having a nice day. It simply means have a nice day. And it can be quite misleading, quite embarrassing, quite I'm remembering now a case where, yes, I went into the American embassy in London to get a visa years and years ago. And it was at a time when there was a lot of trouble going on, a lot of riots and things like that in London because of the Vietnam War, I think it was. Anyway, I go into the office of the embassy and they asked me to fill in the form that you have to do if you're asking for an American visa. And you've done it, probably many of you. It's one of those very long forms which you fill in, which asks you 1,000 questions like, you know, are you mad? Are you a terrorist? Do you have a gun? And all, and you have to sort of say, yes, yes. I mean, no. Anyway, I filled in all these questions and gave the best of answer I could. At the end, there's a paragraph which says, you know, you better have answered these correctly. Otherwise, you know, we're going to get you and sign it here. So I did all that, passed it over the counter and sat back and waited and waited and waited. Other people came in after me, filled in the form and got their visa. And I'm still waiting. And I'm getting very nervous now. And then the lady comes to the desk and she says, Dr. Crystal? And I say, yes. Would you come here, please? Yes. Is this the form you filled in a little while ago? Yes. Did you answer all these questions truthfully? Yes. And then she said to me, okay, with a falling, rising tone. And I nearly fainted because for me, that meant you're in trouble now. But all she did was she said, okay, and stamped the visa and gave it to me and waved bye-bye. You see the I took it to that intonation, that American intonation, to mean I was in trouble. All she meant was, okay, have a nice day. That's all it was. Okay, so you see the example there. It's a good example from pronunciation to illustrate the point that you have to always ask the question, why is a particular, in this case, intonation pattern being used? And then look at the differences between different cultures to see what's going on. And that's my final point before I stop, really, that an awful lot of this is to do with an individual language or dialect or accent. When you now transfer this whole pragmatic perspective to different languages, then all kinds of differences come to the fore. Because why do we in one language use a particular sentence or structure or pronunciation or whatever can be different from the way in which another language uses it? All sorts of things crop up here. In some cultures, you say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, quite naturally. In other cultures, you don't. In some cultures, you stay silent in order to introduce a point. In other cultures, you don't. You get into it quickly. In some cultures, you say please and thank you all the time. In other cultures, you don't. Well, actually, I've had this experience in several times in both France and in Spain and in the Netherlands, where it isn't so routine to say please and thank you. In Britain, please and thanks, one of the first things you teach children at around about the age of 3. Mummy, can I have a biscuit? What did you say? Can I have a biscuit? I haven't heard the little word yet. Can I have a biscuit, please? There's your biscuit. I haven't heard the little word yet. Thank you, Mummy. Yeah? Please and thank you are drilled into British children's ears from a very early age. And so it's perfectly natural for me to say, please, 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 please all the time. And thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you all the time. And I go now to other cultures where they don't do that. And they hear me. I go to France and I say, merci and s'il vous plaît. And I go to Spain and say, por favor, all the time. And I get looked at. You know? Por favor, if you please. Oh, no, I didn't. I just meant por favor. That's all I meant. You know, I didn't mean it. The frequency is so different. My poor little grandson, who is Matteo, who lives in the Netherlands, where they don't say please and thank you, hardly at all. When I go to the Netherlands, I feel sometimes the Dutch seem very rude because they don't do this. When the Dutch people come to Britain, they think that English people are very over effusive. Poor little Matteo learns not to say please and thank you in the Netherlands, comes over here, doesn't say please and thank you and gets told off for not saying please and thank you. And he doesn't know what to do. I mean, he does now, he's 18 now, but when he was 6 or 5, 4, 3 years old, he was very confused about this bilingual issue. So there we are. I think I've talked for, well, actually an hour now, and it's time for me to stop and give some time to you to ask questions and talk about some of these issues a bit further. But just to remind you, all my specific examples relate to a single basic point, and that is that we need to know why language usage is the way it is. Pragmatics is the study of why, the study of the choices we make when we use language, the reasons for those choices and the effects that the choices convey. And these choices affect every aspect of language. And is there any other area of language that goes beyond this question of why? Is it indeed the final frontier? Is there anything else that we can study after we've studied all these explanations? Well, maybe there is. Maybe one day we'll be able to look in there and see what's going on while we're doing all this linguistic work. So maybe there is another frontier in there, the neuro-linguistic frontier that we're just beginning to study in science. So if I were giving this talk in 100 years, then maybe it would be called neuro-linguistics, the final frontier, or something like that. But for the moment, it's pragmatics. So thank you for listening, and let's go on to a little bit of chat maybe now. Thank you, Eskis and Maria.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Crystal. If there are any questions, please write them down in the chat and we will address them.
Yes, I don't see the chat, so I'll need you to read them out.
Okay, for now we have a question from Alonso. He's asking what the current point of view is in pragmatics before audiovisual translation regarding the adaptation of the origin culture into target culture.
Well, I don't think there is a single point of view. One thing we have to remember about pragmatics is that it's a very recent subject. 1980s, 1990s. The journals of pragmatics started to come into existence, you know, around the turn of the century. Quite a lot of research has been done now, but only a fraction of what can be done and one day will be done. So there are all sorts of gaps in our pragmatic study. And one of the biggest gaps of all is gaps to do with cultural difference. I could on my shelf here pull down a journal up to do with pragmatics and point to 10, 20 articles immediately on what's going on in English, for instance, which has been very well studied from a pragmatic point of view, even though there's still lots to be done. And then for every 10 articles to do with English, there might be one on some other language. There's still very little pragmatic research done on most of the languages of the world. And the next step of bringing those two types of pragmatic history together, cultural pragmatics, if you like to call it that, is probably the infant in the field of pragmatics. It's so important, though. It is, I think, the most exciting area to explore. And if our questioner is thinking of working in that area or is already doing so, this is excellent news, because we need more and more of this kind of thing. I'll give you one example of a cultural clash to illustrate the way it goes. And it's in relation to that point I made about silence just towards the end of the talk. I was in Japan, and I'd been invited to give a talk at a bookshop. And after I'd given the talk, we went into a side room where I met the bookshop manager, the owner of the bookshop, and the floor manager where I had given the talk. And there's myself and my wife, and we're sitting round in a big circle there and having some tea. And I sit down and nothing happens. We have the tea and there is silence all around the room. This embarrasses me. I don't know what to do. I have to break this silence. I have to say something. And so I do. I say, there were quite a good crowd at the bookshop today, weren't there? Silence. And then eventually, one of my Japanese colleagues makes a comment. And after a while, I mean, this is some time ago now. Now I know the score. I know what's going on. In Japan, and in some other cultures too, silence is the perfectly normal, acceptable way of having a conversation when you've got no urgency, nothing specific that needs to be said. There is politeness that needs to be expressed. There is reaction. This is not the Anglo-Saxon way at all. Silence is to be broken. Silence is an embarrassment. Silence is to be avoided at all costs. And so when you get two people, one of whom wants to talk all the time and the other one doesn't want to talk all the time, there is a tension which needs to be explored, because it can lead to very important repercussions. Once the talk starts, what is the subject matter going to be? This is another area that pragmatics deals with. What is the appropriate subject matter when you begin a conversation? Now, for the British and for many other cultures, it's the weather, isn't it? What's the weather going to be like? You know, oh, see, it's raining a lot. I mean, I did it this evening myself, didn't I? When I started to talk, I talked about the weather. You see, that's my culture. That's the way it is. It's a way of breaking the ice. Different cultures have different topics for breaking the ice in that way. And some cultures don't have anything at all. In a business meeting, imagine a business meeting now, multicultural business meeting. The British and the Americans and some other cultures, they want to get on with the business quickly. Let's get on with it. Let's get to the topic. Let's get into it. You know, let's get up number point 1 on the agenda. But there are some cultures, Arabic cultures, for example, Japanese and so on, where that is not the point. No, you don't start the business straight away. You talk more generally about life and other things. And I've seen it in meetings where one group of people are hopping up and down, wanting to get to the point, and the other group of people are saying, well, sorry, why are you so anxious? Why is there tension in the room? Let's talk about the lovely weather or the mountains that are in the distance or whatever it might be. You see the kind of thing. Now, people are beginning to study this, but it is a difficult area to study because obviously you need to have native speakers from both sides and people who are able also to see the other person's point of view. So it's a tricky area, but it's beginning to be studied.
Thank you, Dr. Crystal. We have another question from the audience at school. They're asking that given pragmatics is that it's a fairly recent subject, what would you say is the correct way to go forward with this topic?
For all linguistic topics, pragmatics or otherwise, work within the comfortable frame of reference that you know. Always, don't go outside your comfort zone to begin with. In other words, somebody might say, oh, I'd like to study the pragmatics of, and then they talk about some area of life where it's not theirs. They'd have to go and, first of all, understand the area of life before they'd be able to get into the pragmatics of it. No, study the area that you know. So for young people, one of the best areas is to go into the internet and look at examples like the WhatsApp one that I gave. What are the pragmatic issues going on the internet? They're all over the place, aren't they? All over the place. To take a current example, the rise in anger and hate on the internet, hate messages, anger messages, danger messages, and so on. As a result of what? Why do people get so upset? And to the extent that they can be cancelled on the internet for using certain types of language, what's going on? Is it a matter of the fact that there is anonymity there, so they don't know who you are? What is the reason for it? Are there a set of reasons here? What sorts of language are likely to generate that kind of difficulty? Why are people leaving Twitter in their tens of thousands at the moment? Because Elon Musk has just recently taken over Twitter. Why? That's what pragmatics does. It asks you why. Not simply says, there are lots of people leaving. What are the reasons behind it? Now, some of these reasons will be nothing to do with linguistics. They could be to do with politics or religion or anything. But some of them will be to do with the kinds of things you are permitted to say, the kinds of things you are permitted to write, and all those other aspects of language. So I would say, first and foremost, look into the areas where you live. And for young people these days, they live online more than offline, it seems to me. But another example is, well, everyday uses of language, everyday uses of language. Nothing specialized now, nothing to do with science or advertising or anything like that. Everyday uses of language. I gave you one example a few minutes ago, the please and thank you example. Everybody does that all the time. Either they do or they don't, and there are different uses. Here's another one. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Now that's an everyday thing, isn't it? Well, you can study the pragmatics of these things. When do we use these things? Why do we use these expressions? When and why? Remember my present tense example? Present tense is for present time. No, it's more complicated than that. What about this one? Good morning. When do you say good morning? In the morning? It's more complicated than that. No. You can say good morning in the afternoon. I remember when my young son was a teenager and he slept in until 2 o'clock in the afternoon and he comes downstairs, I would say to him, good morning, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right? That sort of thing. Or you doze off. You have siestas still, I suppose, in your world. Concept that is unfamiliar to me over here. But so you have a little sleep and you wake up and somebody could say to you, good morning, even though it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's the sort of thing I mean. There are unexpected ways in which we use these everyday expressions. And here's another example to do with good morning. How often do you say it? And this is something people don't usually realize until they study the pragmatics of it. You say good morning only once to an individual. You don't say it more than once. Here's a scenario. I'm going into a school and I see somebody coming towards me and I say, good morning, John. And they say, good morning, David. 2 minutes later, I'm coming back along the same corridor and I meet the same person. Do I now say, good morning, John, again? No, you don't. If you did, the other person would feel a little upset. So you've said good morning to me already. Why are you saying it again? Was I so unimportant that you don't remember that you said it already? In fact, I don't know whether you do this in Spanish, but in English, you can say to somebody, or apologize and say, I'm sorry, I've said good morning to you already, haven't I? Good night is different. You can say good night to somebody as many times as you like. So now it's the evening time. I'm going down the corridor. And there's John coming towards me. Good night, John. Good night, David. I go to the car. Oh, I've forgotten my bag. I go back into the place again. I pick up my bag. I pass John and I say, good night, John, a second time. No problem. You can say good night as many times as you like. Night, good night, night, good night, night, night. It's the same with hello and goodbye. You tend to say hello just once to somebody. Hello, nice to see you. 2 seconds later, hello, nice to see you. No, you don't do it a second time. But leaving, bye, John, bye. You're at a railway station. Goodbye, bye, 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 goodbye, goodbye. You say it 10 times, 20 times if you want. Did you know that? I ask you now, you can't tell me, but did you know that? You say good morning only once and hello only once and good night and goodbye as many times as you like. You knew it, yes, in your head you knew it. Did you know it intellectually, you see, as an objective statement? That's the sort of thing pragmatics does. Pragmatics brings to light things you already knew without knowing that you knew them, as it were. They're instinct, you've learnt them. And pragmatics brings to light these things. And then the cultural thing comes along, because there may be cultures in the world where you do say good morning several times to a person. I don't know. Or you don't say good morning at all. And then you get back on that interesting question about cultural difference. So work in the area that you know, work in the hobby that you know, the sport that you play. Why do people say certain things in sporting contexts and behave in certain ways in sporting contexts? Interesting question. I don't know of any research on that at all. It's so important. Pragmatics explains the use of slang and abbreviations. Why do we use slang? The chief use of slang is to show that you're one of the gang. In other words, if we're all interested in motorbikes, then we use motorbike slang. And somebody who is outside that doesn't know that slang and shows that they're outside it by not knowing that slang. So it applies to everything that you do, but it's up to you to decide which is the best area to focus on. Choose something within your comfort zone.
Thank you, Dr. Crystal. Another question, a question that I have is, a lot of us who are language teachers, I suppose we use pragmatics or the why things happen in certain points in our teaching, but we would like to know if there's a specific moment where you recommend teaching pragmatics, or do we just weave it in a more holistic way throughout our teaching?
Oh, weave. No question. Yeah, absolutely. Pragmatics is not an advanced stage of language study. It is there underneath everything that we do. And so imagine lesson 1, year 1, chapter 1 of the book. You don't know anything. What is the first thing you're going to learn in teaching a course on English or Spanish or whatever it might be? Well, I mean, there are all sorts of different ways in, but you take a textbook down and the first thing might be basic question like, how old are you? You know, very nice little early simple sentence. And the answer is, you know, whatever it is. How old are you? I've got a book here where that is not actually chapter 1, but I think it's chapter 2 or chapter 3 of the textbook. This is the first year you're doing it. So the student learns the numbers, you know, I am 3, I am 5, I am 15, I am 20, or whatever it might be. And a basic question form in like, very useful, isn't it? Very useful. No, it isn't useful. Or rather, if you look at the pragmatics, you realize that it's dangerous. It's sensitive. Because pragmatics would say, when do you ask people their age? Are you allowed to ask people their age in language? If I were to ask you your age, Maria, how old are you? What's your answer going to be?
The truth.
Don't be cheeky. What business is it of yours? When you study the contexts in which one asks people their age, they're always sensitive. After a certain age, you go to a children's birthday party. Have you had this experience? Go to a children's birthday party. It's a 4-year-old. And all around a birthday card saying 4 and 4 candles on the cake and things like this. And all the adults go up to little Mary and they say, Mary, how old are you? As if Mary doesn't, and Mary says, don't you know? I mean, can't you see? I'm 4, Granny, I'm 4. And how old are you, Granny? Oh, no, dear, you don't ask people. No, you don't ask ladies their age. No. Do you have this in Spanish too? I mean, you certainly, yeah, you're nodding. Yeah. You don't ask ladies their age. Don't ask older people their age. It's rude to do so. And now here is a teaching class where the teacher is saying, how old are you, Johnny? I'm 15. How old are you, Mary? I'm 16. How old are you, teacher? Well, you see, there's a there. And a pragmatic study of age questions would look at things like this. I'm now remembering a personal question. I went to the doctors, having done a certain number of tests and things. And the doctor looks at these tests, looks at me, looks at the tests again and says, how old are you, Mr. Crystal? The implication being, you shouldn't be behaving like this at your age. These tests are saying you should be doing more exercise or some. In other words, it was a danger question. How old are you? Oh, here's one for youngsters. They go into a shop wanting to buy some alcohol. And the shopkeeper says, how old are you? Because you're not allowed to buy alcohol until you're over a certain age. See, all these contexts in which the how old are you question is used. You need to know this. And so if you're teaching how old are you, oh, where do you live? Wow, that one these days with the dangers of the street and so on, you know, all of these questions. It's very interesting to just not scare the kids, I don't mean that, but I mean, you know, bring in a little bit of social reality behind the questions. It need not be only about questions, it could be about anything. I've got a textbook here where I think the third chapter or the fourth, you go shopping. And we're in London and we're going shopping. And we're going shopping in Bond Street. Bond Street, B-O-N-D, Bond Street. And the mother and the father, or whatever it is, are going to buy something in Bond Street. Fine, nothing wrong with that. It's teaching how you talk in a shop and teaching the present tense and things of that kind. Very basic vocabulary, a good exercise in an early textbook. But wait a minute, going shopping in Bond Street? I would never go shopping in Bond Street. Why not? Because it's the most expensive street in London. It's where all the rich people go. I could never afford to go shopping in Bond Street. I'd go shopping in some other type of street. Well, all right, let's use Bond Street, but let the kids know that this is a really expensive street. In other words, the pragmatics will say, why did you go to Bond Street? What was it you're expecting to get there? And things. That little kind of extra discussion of the social background to the exercise is what I mean when I say you can bring pragmatics in very, very early on. And also, of course, for basic things like vocabulary. You're talking about the parts of a car, and the chapter is all about going in a motor car or an automobile. And this is the bonnet. No, it's the hood. No, and the boot. No, it's the trunk. Well, if the textbook is British, why not bring in some American examples at the same time? Or the other way around, if the textbook is American, why not bring in some British examples at the same time? Now, why? Because those kids in your care are in your classroom learning English for how many hours a week? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, I don't know. Outside, online, how many hours a week are they? 20, 30, 40? In other words, they are going to encounter these pragmatic differences online every day of their linguistic lives. So it's good teaching policy, it seems to me, in the classroom to anticipate that outside world, to say, you're learning British English, and so you're going to use these words, but you'll find these other words online because they're American English, or the other way around, you see. You're learning American English, but don't forget that there are these other words as well. And just bringing that kind of pragmatic perspective, not 100% of the time. I'm not a teacher, so heavens, I shouldn't be telling you how to, in any sense, how to teach. But what I have observed in classrooms when I've been in, but the best results come when there's a sort of pragmatic 5 minutes or just 10, just a short part of the class going into these questions, right from year one, right through all the way.
Professor Crystal, I have a question for you too, if you don't mind. You were saying that pragmatics for you is this choice or choices we make when using language. I don't know if this could apply to choosing which language to use, but if so, I have a question about bilingualism, because I know you have written about that too. What for you is the difference between a speaker of a language and a language user? What's the difference between just a speaker and a language user?
Yes, well, use for me is more general than speech. It's speaking and writing and signing and everything. So listening, speaking, reading and writing. So I use the term user in a more general way than just for speaking. But you're absolutely right, Zacchaeus. The pragmatics is not just the study of an individual language within that language. It's also the study of, as I said before, dialects and accents within that language, but now at a more general level, it's the study of languages And the same question arises there in relation to choice. So I am now multilingual. Let's imagine I have 2 or 3 languages in my head, maybe more. They are not equally present. The concept of a balanced bilingual is very rare when one looks at the multilingualism around the world. A general point, multilingualism, remember everybody, is the normal human condition. It is normal to be multilingual. Some people, the people who study this full time, say that something like 3/4 or more of the human race is at least bilingual. So therefore, as I mentioned to you earlier, to be monolingual is actually to be handicapped in some way. You've only got one language. Oh dear. Chomsky was wrong when he said we all have in here a language acquisition device. No, we have a languages acquisition device. It's always multilingualism is it's the norm that we need to study when we're developing our language ideas. Monolingualism is the exception, as it were. This is a radical difference. I mean, traditionally, people studied language from a monolingual point of view. So it's a very different way of looking at things. And so the same question arises. If I have got several languages in here, why do I use them? When do I use them? For what purpose? Why should I switch from one language to the other? Why should I mix my languages in code switching so that I start my sentence in English, switch into Spanish, and then go back into English again, or the other way around? What's going on? This question of why is just so important here, especially when one encounters a really multilingual situation, like in so many parts of Africa, for instance, where people have 5 languages and they don't think twice about it. But here's the point. They don't use those 5 languages equally in all circumstances. This concept of total translation, which is such an important concept in the European Union these days. Everything in English has to be translated into everything in French and so on. That is so unusual. No, in these African communities and else parts of the world too, but I'm remembering this one because it's an area I knew. You might have one language for the home, another language for the school, another language for broadcasting, for listening to broadcasts, another language for the marketplace, and so on. But the thing is that you can't mutually translate between these different areas. The vocabulary that you use in the marketplace is different from the vocabulary you use when you're in school or whatever it might be. And so you can't translate immediately from the language of the marketplace into some other language. One encounters this all the time, doesn't one, really? Just the other day, I met somebody who had had a baby in France, and she now lives in Wales, and she's having another baby. And she said to me, I don't know how to talk about having a baby in English, let alone in Welsh, in English. I learned all my maternity vocabulary when I was in France. I'm going to have to learn it all over again. She could not translate from French maternity vocabulary into English. She just did not have the terminology. Eventually she learned it, of course. And then she could have a job as a translator, translating between English and French maternity vocabulary. But that was later. That would be later. So the whole question of bilingualism, multilingualism, seems to me, has to have a pragmatic perspective, because this is the only way in which you can explain why it is that some people have a good use of a language. They are users in that very strong sense, and other people do not. I am semilingual in so many languages, and that term semilingual is so important. I did a radio program a few years ago on semilingualism. Semilingualism is when you learn a language to a certain extent, but you don't learn it to the extent of being a native speaker because you have no need to. You only need what you need. So I was illustrating this, and I said at the end of the program, how many of you out there listening, this is the BBC World Service, think you are semi-lingual? And I was expecting to get 2 or 3 letters or postcards. I got hundreds and hundreds of cards from people who said, I'm semi-lingual. I didn't realize what it was. And I was ashamed to be semi-lingual. People criticize me. People who know more of the language than I do criticize me for only knowing so much, but I don't need to know any more than I know. I'm perfectly happy in knowing what I know. So this concept of semi-lingualism, which of course, semi is the wrong word, or the wrong prefix, because that means half. Whereas it's really a spectrum of knowing nothing to knowing a little bit to knowing everything, native speaker level. And that notion of fluency is such a variable. If you have learned another language and you are 100% fluent, nobody is 100% fluent in another language. And by 100%, I mean they know everything that a native speaker knows. And if you don't believe me, I could prove it immediately to you by saying to you, all of you out there who consider yourselves, and you are brilliant speakers of English, because I've heard you now for some time, some of you before this evening, brilliant speakers of English. But tell me, how many children's nursery rhymes do you know that you would have learnt when you were age 2 in English? That's the sort of point, you see. You don't know them. You couldn't possibly know them, unless you've been a student of them, of course. And there are areas like this where you don't, they are unachievable because they are to do with aspects of life that are irrelevant to your current notion of fluency. So this notion of semilingualism, I have it all the time here in Wales. You know, Welsh is an endangered language, and people say, you must learn Welsh, you must learn Welsh. My answer is, everybody in Wales knows some Welsh. And they look at me and say, how can that be? Because the road signs are in Welsh as well as in English. And if you're coming to the end of a road and it says slow down, it says slow down in English and it says slow down in Welsh. Araf, which is the Welsh for slow down. Every English speaker knows this. So they know 0.00001% of Welsh. But it's the beginning of a career track to learning more Welsh. And one day it'll be 1% and then 2%. They learn, in other words, as much as they need to know. And that for me is the difference between my concept of user. You use as much as you need. Sorry, long answer to a short question as a yes.
Oh, that's a perfect answer, actually, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Crystal. We have another question from San Diego State. They want to know if there are other recent studies in regards to the role of pragmatics in language assessment and evaluation.
Yeah, well, the best thing to do is there are 2 best ways of keeping up to speed on this. One is to go online and type into Google Journal of Pragmatics or something like this. And all the big pragmatics journals are up there now, but not very many of them, but they're very good. And they also these days give you an archive and you can easily search and find, you know, you can talk about English or Spanish or whatever it might be, or even particular topics like politeness or swearing. We haven't talked about swearing this evening. That's another big area of pragmatics. You haven't heard me swear or use obscenities in English at all this evening, have you? This morning, sorry, it's evening here, morning for you. No. Does that mean I do not know how to swear in English? Of course it does not, but I'm not going to use swear words now. It would be inappropriate. It would be impolite and so on. That's another big area. Well, you'll find there's quite a literature on swearing in these journals. So that's one place I would go. If you're seriously interested as an academic in pragmatics or as somebody wanting to do research, then look up the International Pragmatics Association. These days, there are associations for everything, aren't there? And there is indeed a body of people who get together and have conferences and things like this in the area of pragmatics. So, I would start there. And of course, there are now these days, 20 or 30 introductions to the subject, which of course is a good way of beginning.
Thank you, Dr. Crystal. Are you okay for another question?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm fine. It's not midnight yet.
Excellent. Then we have one last question. And they're asking if there is a link between discourse analysis and pragmatics, and if you could please point to its literature or studies.
Oh, yes, of course there is indeed. You remember when I talked about the growth of linguistics over the century? Phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics. Now, let's go back a little bit. Syntax. What is that? That is the study of sentences, according to Chomsky, and of course, for many people before. But it was quickly realized soon after the 1950s that there is also a syntax beyond the sentence. You can have the syntax of paragraphs, the syntax of, well, any kind of conversation, really. And that's when people realized that it was actually very unrealistic to restrict the study of grammar, and therefore vocabulary and semantics and everything else, just to sentence structure. Sentence sequence was just as important, indeed more important in some ways, because how often do we communicate just in single sentences? And the answer is hardly ever, except in some very unusual situations. So sentence sequence came into focus. And so now how are we going to describe this new kind of study where we're looking at not bottom up from sounds to syllables to words to sentences, but top down from texts and conversations and all that area down into the study of sentences? What do we call this field? Well, there were several suggestions. In the world of literature, it came usually to be called text analysis or text linguistics or something like that. In the study of speech, it was often called conversation analysis, or, the questioner has asked, discourse analysis. The trouble with the word discourse, though, is that it has an ambiguity because it can apply to both spoken and written, and indeed signed language too. So discourse analysis generally then became the much more general term for the study of communicative events, which are either spoken or written or signed, where the unit is the functional communicative unit, whatever it is, a speech, a conversation, a play, a poem, a novel, an advertising slogan, anything, you see, from the top down. So discourse analysis became a new subject, really, again, at more or less the same time as pragmatics was developing. Now you see the difference. Discourse analysis is part of the meta-language of linguistics over here. Of each of these areas, you can ask, what use is it? How is it used? Why is it used? Why is it used? So now, discourse analysis. Why is this particular piece of discourse being used? What is the reason behind it? What effects does it have? Why is there an advertising slogan here? Discourse analysis will analyze the advertising slogan. Why is it being used? Should it be used? What effect will it have? Should we be advertising to children? Or should we not be advertising to children? What sort of advertisements are appropriate? If an advertiser says, our brand is better, a pragmatic approach would be saying, Better than what? Why you say, what is the basis for your claim? You know, entry is prohibited. Remember that example? Well, why is the advertising slogan there? What are they trying to do? And all of that. Are there some areas where advertising is different from others? If you're advertising a cure, a vaccine for COVID, then that sort of advertising is very different from advertising washing machines or something. So the pragmatic approach looks more generally at the discourse of a particular area that is being studied. And it's just as relevant there, it seems to me, as anywhere else.
Thank you, Dr. Crystal. That was our last question of the day.
Oh, well, there we are. Well, look, this has been fun. At least I hope it has. I've enjoyed it, even though I can only see some of you. And what I miss now is is what happens afterwards. Normally, after a talk in Mexico, I remember going to an amazing restaurant and having some amazing wine. Zacchaeus, you don't actually have a technique, do you, of sending me some Mexican wine through the system, do you?
I wish I could do that, Professor. I can't.
Oh, dash. Well,
Really wish I could. Yeah.
I'll have to go and find my own drink downstairs.
Hopefully, when Mark Zuckerberg develops more his metaverse, we will be able to do that.
Ah, yeah, one day. One
yeah.
day.
And lastly, Professor, we really want to say thank you. Thank you to your wonderful wife, as she was a link to for this event to happen, of course. Thank you for your time, for sharing your knowledge with us here. We had some technical problems, that is true, but we really appreciate your spending some time with us here this evening for you there and this morning for us on here. And I don't know if you would like, if you have just a few seconds probably, so we can turn on our cameras and take a picture, like a screenshot, so we can have this, because as I said before, trust me, Professor, you are like the child, like we're children here, like we're meeting just our superhero. And I'm gonna ask everyone to turn their cameras on, please.
Yeah, I not only have I got human beings, I see a cat emerging.
Yeah.
Antonio, is a pussy cat from down there. Yeah, that's another area, the pragmatics of animal noises. Very, very important area. Why are you meowing at me? What do you need?
All right,
Yeah.
I'm gonna take a screenshot. Also, please smile.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Just next. Thank you, Professor, for again. Thank you, everybody, for turning your cameras on. And again, we won't be able to thank you enough for this opportunity, and hopefully we can just have another talk sometime in the future. Well,
it would be a delight. It would be a delight. Health permitting, and that would be great. So goodbye, everybody. Thank you. And as is the normal way of, you see, this is another pragmatic thing. These days, you don't just say goodbye, do you? You say goodbye and stay safe. Stay safe. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crystal. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor. Bye-bye.